a night on the trail, trying to sleep in a covered wagon as snow fell all around. History for sleep. The cold crept in first, not dramatically, just a whisper of it, curling around the ankles of tired pioneers as night fanned out across the prairie. The wind had that curious tone that says, "Oh, I'll be back," then disappears, only to return 5 minutes later with extra flourish and a bit more drama. February on the trail was a masterclass in unnecessary bravado on the part of Mother Nature. She did not do subtle. Inside one of the many creaking canvas-covered wagons lined like a lumpy caterpillar across the white blanketed plains, a family of 5 attempted the near impossible, getting comfortable in what amounted to a wooden shoebox rolling through history. Covered wagons, those beloved prairie schooners, were not built with luxury in mind. They had no insulation, no windows, and certainly no regard for your lower back. With wheels designed more for drama than smoothness, each mile of the Oregon Trail was a chiropractic gamble. Now imagine bedding down for the night in one of these wagons after a day of eating the functional but flavorless joy that was hardtack. Essentially, a Victorian-era protein bar made of regret. If you were lucky, there might be beans, unspiced, historically accurate beans. You've got Pa, a sturdy man, whose default scent is axle grease and moderate panic, trying to light the oil lantern without losing a thumb. Ma, ever resourceful, fluffing the hay-filled mattress which has, over time, settled into the shape of something between a canoe and a resentment. The 3 children, possibly named things like Ezra, Clementine, and Quiet Down You Heathen, are arguing over who gets to share the one quilt that somehow smells like sheep and cinnamon. Snow had started gently that evening, the kind of snow that seems apologetic at first. Soft flakes kissed the canvas with a pattering that could almost be called soothing if you weren't also thinking about wolves, frostbite, and whether the general store back in Independence sold regrets in bulk. Let's talk comfort for a moment. There was none. Blankets were scarce. Boots stayed on all night, half for warmth, half because losing them was a real option in a wagon where everyone's possessions were constantly playing hide and seek. And yes, if you're wondering, privacy was not a thing. Your nighttime lullaby came courtesy of your brother's snoring and your baby sister's highly inconvenient appetite for 3 a.m. attention. The fire outside was long dead, the coals smothered by Ma with the confidence of a woman who once extinguished a blaze with soup. Even for seasoned pioneers, temperatures below freezing were an unwelcome overachiever. Their breath made delicate ghosts each time someone sighed or muttered a prayer to whichever saint oversees frostbitten toes. Still, strangely, there was comfort to be found. The rhythm of the night on the prairie had a certain drowsy cadence. Soft wind through canvas flaps, the occasional horse exhaling, its breath visible in the dim glow like some guardian spirit assigned to hoofed security. Above, the stars, so sharp in their clarity they bordered on smug, offered a silent canopy to remind everyone that, inconvenient as the journey was, they moved through something vast and declaratively beautiful. And Ma, bless her, was a woman who knew how to tell a bedtime story amidst the creaks of wagon springs and the distant howl of coyotes. She'd spin tales of life back east, with porches and picket fences and wild things like fresh milk every day. She described the department store, which was like a general store, but better lit and filled with unnecessary laces. And the children, curled like commas in their shared cocoon of quilts and coats, would listen, wide-eyed or half asleep, depending on who had managed to avoid the molasses candy earlier. for just long enough to drift off. Outside, the snow piled on the wagon with the casual persistence of a cat settling into your lap. Inside, warmth was a collective notion, a mingling of bodies, breath, and something defiant that stirred in pioneer stomachs and said, well, we're still here. That night, as the wind did its best one-man performance of ominous whistling and the wagon groaned in its frozen joints, the family finally drifted into sleep. It wasn't comfortable, but it was enough. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let the wind fade for now. Let the snow tap gently at your dreams. There are more nights to come yet. The moon hung like a lazy lantern above the Great Plains, casting its pale light over the canvas tops of the wagons, which looked less like noble vessels of destiny and more like soggy loaves of bread left out in the cold. Our wagon, unfortunately positioned at a slight tilt after one wheel had oafishly introduced itself to an ambitious gopher hole, creaked and rocked gently in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of wool, leather, and a hint of simmered beans that someone had spilled 2 days ago, and everyone had politely agreed not to talk about. Lying down for the night in the cramped confines of a covered wagon was less like rest, and more like participating in a very slow, very uncomfortable experiment in human origami. You folded yourself into whatever shape best fit the available space, wedging elbows among hammock ropes of drying socks, bumping your toes against a butter churn, and quietly wondering whether your foot had just touched your cousin or a sack of flour. It was best not to ask. Outside, the wind stirred the snow into soft spirals, brushing clean the footprints and wagon trails of the day. Somewhere, perhaps a few wagons over, a harmonica wheezed a lonesome tune, probably "O Susanna" for the 97th time, the unofficial anthem of the westward expansion, not because it inspired courage, but because nobody could stop playing it or escape it. Sleeping arrangements on the trail followed a time-honored system of equal discomfort. Children were stacked like kindling towards the front of the wagon, or tucked under benches like cozier, noisier firewood. Grown-ups curled beside barrels and trunks that held all the earthly possessions they deemed valuable enough to survive rattling over 1,600 miles of wilderness. Quilts were shared and disputed with the tense diplomacy of international treaties. Tonight, like many before and after, the cold was a living thing, curling into the corners, prodding noses, and making itself entirely at home. Pioneers tried all sorts of methods to stay warm: heated stones, layers of quilts, and the occasional passive-aggressive argument over who stole the blanket in their sleep. Some even brought along dogs not for companionship, but as portable heaters who occasionally barked at shadows and had suspicious breath. Inside one particular wagon, a man by the name of Elbridge Thistlethwaite, yes, that was his real name, and yes, his parents claimed to have chosen it with love and a mild disregard for pronunciation, shifted beneath 2 coarse quilts and a buffalo robe. He was lying on his side in a position that could only be described as desperately speculative. Elbridge was a dreamer, a former school teacher who had read books about the open frontier and imagined quiet evenings spent sipping coffee while majestic herds of buffalo stopped to admire his neatly lettered journal entries. What he had discovered instead was that buffalo smelled like wet rugs that had lost a bar fight, and hot coffee was a twice-a-week miracle contingent on someone remembering to clean the tin kettle. Elbridge had also learned the particular hardship of trying to fall asleep when someone else's foot was tickling your ribs through a blanket, and when your hat, meant to keep your head warm, had inexplicably migrated to your left shin. The noise of the trail didn't sleep either. Canvas flapped like lazy thunder. Horses shifted in their picket lines, huffing warm breaths into the cold air. A baby cried and then fell mysteriously silent, a quiet that was either peaceful or ominously tactical. From the wagon just behind, someone accidentally knocked over a tin pail, and the sound was so sudden, so metallically dramatic, it briefly convinced a half-asleep Elbridge that the British were back. That night's snow was soft and solemn, falling in thick flakes that muffled the prairie. It made everything look gentle, peaceful. Even the rattling stovepipe jutting from the wagon wall, defying engineering and good sense, looked picturesque, glowing faintly orange with embers, as though it were a tiny lighthouse in a cotton sea. From under his blanket cocoon, Elbridge muttered a line from Virgil, which no one heard, and which he almost certainly misquoted, and then yawned with all the weight of a man who knew the oxen would not care that he'd slept poorly when it was their turn to be hitched at dawn. The trail was long, and sleep was precious. Even a few hours lulled to the sound of snow tapping canvas like a forgotten lullaby could be enough to dream, perhaps of home, or if you were Elbridge, of a breakfast that didn't involve beans. Outside, the snow deepened, quietly erasing the dust of the journey and tucking the wagon train beneath a soft white hush. And just beyond, in the pale edge of the prairie night, the coyotes started singing again, or possibly arguing over a rabbit. Either way, it was time to drift a little further into the warmth of dreams, where even drafty wagons could become castles. The wagon wheels had finally stopped creaking, like a cranky symphony of old wooden limbs settling in for the night. Outside, the snow deepened in its silence, blanketing the prairie in that particular hush only winter can command, like a librarian with frost on her lashes. Inside the covered wagon, things were, shall we say, less serene. Imagine, if you will, a canvas-topped cocoon, stiff from the cold, smelling faintly of smoke, damp straw, and a smidge of regret. The oxen stood somewhere outside, chewing cud under the impression that they were not, in fact, standing in the middle of a great American dream, but had simply wandered into the worst camping trip ever. Inside, though, families made do. They always did. Take the Clayman's family, for instance, curled up in the corner of their wagon like spoons in a drawer, the eldest child holding a tin cup of lukewarm coffee with the solemnity of a priest with holy water. It was weak coffee, more memory than beverage, but it was warmish, and that counted for something. Mama Clemens was struggling to get the wagon flap to stay closed, the draft smuggling tiny icy breezes through gaps that canvas alone could never hope to defend. She muttered historical profanity under her breath, thunderation, and land's sakes alive, which, while not technically curses, had serious 19th century sting. The flap, however, remained defiantly flappy. Now, you must understand, these wagons were not the Cadillac of sleep arrangements. You had maybe 2 blankets per person, less if you'd had to trade one for a bag of beans or a slightly haunted frying pan back in Missouri. The mattress was often just a pile of straw or shucks, sometimes burlap sacks filled with items of extremely questionable softness. Pillows, only if you counted a rolled-up flannel shirt, or Cousin Bertha's surprisingly cushioned bonnet. Eli Clemens, age 11, and attempting to be strong like his pa, tried to shrug off the chill, but his teeth had other ideas. They chattered like tiny cymbals at the back of a hoedown. He tucked his arms across his chest and stared out through a crack in the wagon's canvas, watching the snowflakes outside perform a somber ballet in the moonlight. He had imagined this trip would feel more like adventure and less like prolonged dampness. But there was something magical in the quiet, a heavy stillness that came when the horses stopped snorting, when even the coyotes decided it was just too cold to yip. His younger sister, Betsy, lay beside him, gripping her rag doll, which was missing one button eye and approximately half her stuffing. "She's half the woman she was in St. Louis," Betsy had proudly declared earlier that week. Betsy didn't mind the snow. She thought it looked like sugar falling from God's windows, and had told everyone as much until someone made her stop for the sake of world peace. From outside, the muffled clink of something metal against something colder hinted at Pa tending to the fire. Fires had to be watched in this kind of weather. It wasn't enough to keep warm. You had to keep from becoming a permanent part of the landscape. Prairie cold was a breed of chill that reminded you how very far from civilization you'd chosen to wander. And let's not forget the wind, always waiting, always whispering impolite suggestions through every seam of your clothing. Still, there were comforts. If you pressed your back against the wool-covered sides of your sister, and you shared the family's only knitted shawl, and you pretended that the rising steam from your own breath was actually the warmth of your grandmother's stove, it was almost like home. Almost. The stars above, visible through the cracks when the clouds parted, looked closer than usual. Eli watched them, wondered if his spelling lessons would ever come in handy out here. Probably not. No one ever asked you to write an essay about manifest destiny while your socks froze to your ankles. Still, he dreamt of somewhere beyond, of reaching the mountains they'd read about, of a house that didn't rock or creak or smell vaguely of pickled onions. And as Pa returned, cheeks red and boots crunching with tiny icicles, and Mama finally coaxed the stubborn canvas flap into submission, using what appeared to be a hairpin and a well-placed glare, it was time for sleep. The kind of sleep families on the trail took in shifts, each person lying slightly on top of someone else to share what little heat they could muster, like a human lasagna of dreams and snoring. Outside, the snow deepened, and inside the night grew quieter. The fire crackled faintly. The oxen shifted in their sleep, or maybe just in protest. And overhead, the wind whispered, weaving its chilly lullaby through canvas and dreams, guiding the Wagon family gently toward another hour under starry silence. As somewhere beyond the prairie, the clouds began to move. The snow had started its quiet descent sometime after dusk, although no one noticed at first. Out on the prairie, there's a strange kind of darkness that folds over everything. A darkness so complete, it's as if someone has knit a thick wool sock around the whole wagon. Then, out of that blackness, the snow had floated down, not in gusts or squalls, but gently, as though the sky were carefully tucking the landscape in for the night. Inside the covered wagon, which smelled faintly of flannel, smoked ham, and the permanent dampness of wool socks, the family was settling in for a night of semi-conscious shivering under a pile of quilts that deserved medals for service. Sleep on the trail wasn't so much an experience as it was a negotiation with your spine, the weather, and everyone else's elbows. Aunt Millie, who had an entirely unjustified habit of snoring like a congested steamboat, had already fallen asleep. Her snores echoed off the wooden slats of the wagon frame like a lazy foghorn lullaby. The baby, who, for reasons known only to pioneers and sleep-deprived historians, was named Zebediah Franklin Lightning III, made occasional grumbling noises in his little bassinet fashion from a barrel cut in half, and lined with old copies of the Farmer's Almanac. These were not soothing sounds, but they were familiar, and that counted for something. Outside, the wind seemed to die down a little, perhaps tiring itself out from hours of taunting the canvas covers, which flapped and creaked like ship sails lost at sea. Snow padded the earth in thick, downy layers, muffling the usual night noises. The coyotes, perhaps, had decided that even howling was too much energy expenditure in a squall. Either that, or they'd finally frozen to their metaphysical limit, traded dignity for silence, and were quietly spooning under an overturned wheelbarrow somewhere. Meanwhile, Pa sat near the back of the wagon, tucked into what might generously be called a sitting position. It involved several kinds of angles that the human body was never meant to sustain. He was reading aloud, softly, from the family's one remaining book, an extremely weathered copy of Practical Cheese-Making for the Frontier Gentleman. This had originally been used as ballast, but following the incident with the unwanted raccoon and the misplaced beef jerky drawer, it had earned a place of honor as a multi-purpose text. "And should your curds fail to separate," Pa read in his low molasses voice, "fear not, for many a fine brie has started life in confusion." The children, wide-eyed and pretending not to be tired, giggled into the folds of their blankets. It wasn't the story they cared about. No one under the age of 30 has willingly absorbed cheese facts that close to bedtime. But more that Pa's voice made everything feel safe, even in the middle of nowhere, even as the storm whispered on. The lantern, its flame curled into a respectful little hush, cast delicate shadows across the wagon. The silhouette of a boot, a darning needle, the mysterious lump at the food end of the crate that might have been a preserved turnip or might have been one of Cousin Eli's forgotten taxidermy projects. The truth was mercifully obscured. As the cold deepened, Ma reached out from under 7 layers of blanket and wool to poke Pa on the ankle with a knitting needle. "If you don't lie down soon," she whispered, "you'll fossilize right there." Pa closed the book slowly, folding the corner as if cheese-making wisdom might be needed in a hurry come morning. He tucked it beneath the crate of onions, which wasn't so much a storage decision as the culinary equivalent of passive aggression. The onions were terrible, but no one was brave enough to pitch them into the snow. He curled himself into the narrow gap beside Ma and sighed. From above, the snow whispered softly against the canvas roof, each flake a whisper of winter's quiet insistence. It was a night built for reflection, for stillness, or for contemplating whether one's toes would in fact survive till morning. Then, of course, there was Eli. Out, in the lean-to adjacent to the wagon, Eli had insisted he didn't need the heat, said it built character, also said he didn't trust the confines of a wagon, claimed it'd make him wake up all feral, whatever that meant. The family was jolted, if gently, by a muffled yelp, some creative swearing, and a sound suspiciously like a man trying to discipline a goat with a rolled-up map. "Still character building," Ma sighed. "Sounds like his icicles are arguing back," Pa murmured. Eventually, silence returned, along with the snow, settling over the prairie, the wagon, and the strange, beautiful absurdity that was frontier life. And somewhere just past the horizon of dreams, morning's first frost began to quietly paint the world. Sleep had not yet arrived, despite several stern requests for it to do so. The wagon creaked a little less now, as if even it had grown cold and tired of complaining. Outside, the wind passed through the camp like a ghost wearing wool, socks, not particularly threatening, but persistent and oddly polite. It spent most of its time whistling through cracks in the canvas, searching for someone to chill personally. Inside the wagon, the McAllister family resembled a dysfunctional pile of quilts, boots, elbows, and vague regret. Thomas McAllister, patriarch and occasional fiddle enthusiast, was attempting to make peace with the lumpy burlap sack he had chosen as a pillow. His wife, Margaret, who had already mentally returned to Ohio 3 times this week, was cocooning herself in so many layers of wool that she had become a sort of Highland caterpillar. And the children, well, when children are cold and tired on the Oregon Trail, they possess startling similarities to large complaining potatoes. The snow had thickened, as if Mother Nature had taken a second look around and muttered, "Not quite miserable enough," before shaking out another cloudy spoonful. At least one chicken had taken refuge beneath the wagon, perhaps philosophizing about the poor life choices that had led it here. Now, the curious thing about sleeping on the trail was that sleep didn't quite mean what it does today. In modern terms, sleep is a gentle, uninterrupted voyage aboard a silent mattress ship to the land of dreams. On the Oregon Trail, sleep was more of a negotiation, a loosely arranged ceasefire between your body, your circumstances, and the aforementioned wind. The canvas above them snapped sporadically, like an irritated librarian shushing the elements. The oxen nearby emitted the occasional snort, followed by long silences that sounded suspiciously like judgment. Night didn't fall so much as sprawl across the plains, a dark, icy blanket stretched too thin by stars. But here, in the midst of all that discomfort, was something oddly charming. The absurdity of so many hopeful humans rolling westward with chamber pots, pickled beets, and dubious maps had a kind of accidental poetry to it. People were stubbornly optimistic, even when sleeping arrangements were one itchy blanket away from mutiny. And if one listened carefully, past the wind and the sighs and the distant hoot of an unusually sarcastic owl, you could almost hear the heartbeat of collective determination. Margaret, wrapped up like a leftover ham, whispered into the darkness, "Next time, we stay in Cincinnati." Thomas, who still held onto a romantic notion that somewhere ahead lay a heavenly patch of farmland, simply grunted. It was a sound somewhere between agreement and the attempt to swallow a yawn without using your face muscles. It's worth noting that settlers back then often slept fully clothed, not due to any particular modesty or panic about surprise visitors, but mainly because they feared the frigid air would chew off their limbs in the night. Pajamas were a luxury. Most people wore their boots to bed, a practice history has unkindly forgotten to criticize more often. Feet emerged in the morning like sour bread loaves, warm, pungent, and slightly confused. As the family settled further into their layered burrito formation, an interesting lull occurred, a rare pocket of stillness where nobody needed to scratch, shuffle, or nudge. It lasted all of 14 seconds. Then little Nora embarked on a lengthy coughing soliloquy, which was interpreted by her siblings as both a personal insult and a call for vengeance. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Margaret muttered, flopping a protective blanket over the child with the exasperated tenderness of someone who regrets both parenting and wagon travel in equal measure. "If anyone needs me, I'll be fantasizing about featherbeds." And so, the night wore on, in wool and wind and intermittent groans. Despite the chaos, dreams did come eventually, like small, stubborn riders arriving late to the journey. They brought memories of warm kitchens and garden rows, and the peculiar luxury of being able to sleep without listening for predators or rolling downhill. Somewhere outside, the wind paused. A momentary stillness passed over the camp. It was the kind of pause that suggested something was shifting, perhaps in the weather, or in the hearts of the travelers, or maybe just in the mood of the snow itself. Whatever the cause, it was a breath of calm. And as the covered wagons huddled closer under the quiet snowfall, a new sound drifted in from the edge of the night, a soft, rhythmic creaking from a distant wagon, and the faint, unmistakable hiccup of someone trying to build a fire with wet wood and questionable optimism. The snow didn't fall so much as it gathered, like a conspiracy of silence, quiet, steady, and utterly uninterested in your opinion. Around the wagon, the white flakes thickened on tree limbs, roof cloth, and mulebacks with the stubborn persistence of a mother-in-law helping reorganize your only drawer. Inside the wagon, it was less picturesque. The fire they'd cooked over earlier had been reduced to embers hours ago, buried now beneath ash and regret. The scent of charred bacon still tickled the air, blending strangely with the faint, musty tang of damp canvas and unwashed boots. Hattie Stillwell, who hadn't changed her socks since Missouri, was wrapped in 2 quilts and one existential crisis. Everyone had one. Crises, like snowflakes, were unique, yet everyone had one. The wagon cover flapped occasionally with the wind, rattling its wooden frame like a sleep-deprived percussionist. Young Eli, whose job was to keep the firewood dry, had done an admirable job of keeping himself dry instead. The logs, meanwhile, resembled sponge cake left out in the rain, which was an apt metaphor for morale at the moment. Far from the muffled chaos on the upper bunk, built of creaking timbers and unverified optimism, old Marjorie Tabor was murmuring prayers into her woolen bonnet, though whether they were for divine mercy or just to wish her cornbread wouldn't freeze again was up for debate. Historical records, sadly, do not preserve the theological priorities of freezing pilgrims. The canvas overhead had started collecting snow like a bored collector of vintage postage stamps. Except, instead of Queen Victoria's smiling face, it acquired small cold puddles that eventually gave way, dripping straight onto the center of Eli's forehead. He didn't stir. Sleep had claimed him, likely as a defense mechanism. Meanwhile, the oxen slumbered outside beneath hastily tied wool blankets with names stitched into them. Barnaby and Molasses, the great beasts of burden, who, despite their job titles, didn't like to be burdened or teased. It was said among the wagoneers that Barnaby once sneezed on a preacher, then looked pleased about it. This account may have grown in the telling, but what else were these travellers to do but embellish and repeat? Storytelling, after all, was the only thing more portable than dysentery out west. At the edge of camp, near a frostbitten ash tree, Walter Dimsdale, token intellectual and part-time weatherman, had fashioned himself a science experiment from an empty bean tin, some leftover coffee grounds, and freshly accumulated snow. He'd declared it a noble attempt at percolation, and later, after drinking the result, declared all future weather to be against us. But even among the shivers and snoring, an odd sort of peace settled in. The distant howls of coyotes blended in with the groans of the wind through tree branches. 2 ancient sounds whispering a lullaby written in ice and pine bark. The kind of lullaby that doesn't keep children from nightmares, but reminds them that winter doesn't last forever. The idea of sleep on the trail had always been a complicated one. There was technically sleep, the formal act of unconsciousness. But then there was trail sleep, equal parts nodding off and bracing oneself for raccoons, drafty flaps, or the sound of great Uncle Lester talking in. His sleep about geese he had wronged. Oh yes, great Uncle Lester. His great feather vendetta was the stuff of odd tales and pillow mutterings, recounted at night with a tinge of dread and a touch of embroidery. The truth was likely less dramatic, but as far as the children were concerned, he'd crossed a gaggle and lived to regret it. Beyond the flameless campfire and slumbering wagons, the snowfall continued to thicken like a well-cooked porridge. No wind howled in earnest now, just the slow hush of snow balancing itself over the plains, dusting the world in a white forgetfulness. Somewhere beneath their piled quilts, the families on this journey shifted in their sleep, dreaming, perhaps, of springtime, or beans that weren't cold, or roads that weren't mostly ruts and curse words. And just as the moon slipped behind a gauze of clouds, the horses stamped in their sleep, snorting softly, perhaps in agreement, or perhaps remembering warmer stables in places far behind them. Beyond all this, beyond the tips of trees and the shimmer of frost, a new sound began to rise in the vast darkness. A creak on the wind, a wheel shifting in its sleep, a quiet rustle, almost a whisper, of something arriving, or beginning. The wind had finally quieted to a sigh, like an old man leaning back in a creaky rocking chair after telling yet another story that started with "back in my day." The snow had stopped falling too, perhaps deciding it was time for a break, or maybe just realizing it was no match for stubborn frontier sleepers wrapped in wool and good intentions. Inside the wagon, warm breath mingled with the scent of wet canvas and the faint, ever-present aroma of beans that hadn't quite been cleaned out of the cookpot. It was the hour when everything softened. Edges, sounds, even memories. Sleep on the trail, if you managed to wrestle it into staying put, came wrapped in strange dreams and the soft groans of wood shrinking in the cold. Martha, our courageous and increasingly chapped heroine, blinked up at the dim ceiling, the curved wooden ribs holding up the canvas like the inside of a whispering whale. She lay nestled in 3 layers of wool blankets, 2 of which had names. One was dubbed Sleepy George for its miraculous ability to gather hayseeds, lint, and the occasional biscuit crumb. The other was Maud the Blanket because it had a loud opinion on everything, especially whenever it was folded the wrong way. They weren't alone, of course. A wagon on the trail was a shared thing. Shared with family, yes, but also shared with mildew, mouse dreams, and that one teapot that rattled its own mysterious ghost tune whenever the wind blew west. Tonight, the wagon was quieter than usual. Even young Eli had stopped shifting in his sleep, dreaming hearty pioneer dreams of shoelace puddings and taming feral raccoons, with mixed success. Through a tiny slit in the canvas flap, the moon peered in like a nosy neighbor. It cast a cold light upon the bucket they designated absolutely not for soup, and upon the pile of winter boots that had been at war with a pair of suspiciously mischievous socks. Martha shifted slightly, trying to find comfort on a straw-stuffed mattress that had gone flat somewhere around Fort Kearney. Despite her aching back and a sneezing fit earlier, brought on by a wild dispute between candle smoke and itchy wool fibers, she found herself smiling. It was the kind of peace that only trail nights offered. Total, uninterested peace. No letters to respond to, no loud pianos, no one asking how many eggs went into custard. Hint, not none, Albert. Just the stillness of snow settling in drifts, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the steady breath of those she kept safe. She thought lazily of Mrs. Dawson and her philosophical pig, who apparently could tell the time by when it flopped down into the hay. And she remembered how startled she'd been that very morning when little Hannah declared that she would no longer be kept in a dress without pockets, because where else would I keep my serious rock? These were the rhythms of trail life: complaint, compromise, and the quiet comfort of simply getting through another day together without losing too many spoons. Outside, the snow blanketed the ruts in the ground, smoothing over Wagon's tracks like a forgiving editor smoothing over grammatical sins. The fire had been banked, buried gently to preserve its embers overnight. It was survival disguised as bedtime routine. There was an art to it, just the right number of coals, a scoop of ash, and a whispered plea to the spirit of combustion not to abandon you before dawn. Even the oxen, tethered and munching hay with sleepy disinterest, seemed to exhale with less effort now. Their stubborn patience had gotten them this far, along with Martha's refusal to accept that wheels were supposed to fall off every other weekend. She still half suspected the wheelwright back in Illinois had made the wagon deliberately wonky just to create job security for other wheelwrights down the line. Martha wriggled a little deeper into her blankets, becoming one with Sleepy George and Maud the blanket, who for once put aside their passive-aggressive rustling. Let the snow come. Let the mountains wait their turn. For now, there was just this moment, this warmth, this breath. Somewhere nearby, a tin cup shifted in its crate. It wasn't much, but on the trail, even a clinking cup sounded like life continuing. And just as her eyes began to surrender their battle, she remembered, quietly and fondly, that tomorrow would bring 3 river crossings, 2 cook fires, and 1 mysteriously headless gingerbread man. But that, of course, was a thought for another quiet night. The wind sang its quiet lullaby across the plains, threading through canvas wagon covers and chilling the whiskers of anyone foolish enough to poke their nose out. Snowflakes drifted sideways, slow-moving acrobats balancing on the thin current of prairie air. Inside the covered wagon, you lay bundled in as many layers as your mortal body could find within arm's reach. Quilt, buffalo hide, small child, possibly someone's bonnet. Anything that might stop the slow migration of cold up your back. Despite the deeply uncooperative weather, some noises remained stubbornly loyal to waking hours. Somewhere outside, a mule sneezed with the force of a cannon discharge, followed by a stern reprimand from a teamster lodging verbal complaints at the heavens. "Ain't no sense in a mule having bronchitis," he muttered. Of course, frontier medicine for mules amounted to not a lot more than stern glances and oats. Within the cramped corridors of your cloth-covered home on wheels, the air had thickened with the nighttime scent of damp wool and wooden axles, with the faintest trace of somebody's winter onions stored in the backboard. You shifted slightly to make room for your elbow, which had fallen asleep long before you did. Outside, the camp remained very much vertical. The fires had long since been damped, but the coals pulsed red in places where buffalo chips had once bravely burned. A few silhouettes wandered the perimeter. A man on watch duty, crunching softly through snow, and a woman whose cloak dragged dramatically, like she'd practiced being mysterious. She was, in fact, just looking for where she'd left her ladle. Sleep on the trail was honest work. And by honest, I mean it occasionally included sharing a bedroll with someone who kicked in Morse code and snored like a tuba in a windstorm. One mustn't think of snoring as a flaw during these early wagon years. No, it was considered passive bear deterrence. Somewhere around what may have been midnight, though time had long departed for a less chaotic century, you were roused gently, not by a call to action or a sudden danger, but by a melody. It was the soft twang of a fiddle played carefully, reverently, as though the musician were afraid to wake the snow. Camp musician, a noble but unrecognized position on many wagon trains, was often ex-blacksmith, part-time preacher, and proud owner of an instrument that had lived through more blizzards than it had concerts. The tune was Rosie in the Bow, a folksy number that had wandered west alongside hopes and badly copied land deeds. The sound drifted from a nearby wagon, where an older man sat cross-legged, eyes closed, fiddling not for an audience but for the ghosts of every place he'd left behind. That's the kind of music you get on a trail like this, part hymn, part memory, all rustle and ache. Elsewhere in the camp, small conversations sleepwalked around the wagons. There were hushed voices swapping tales purely for the comfort of sound. Nothing too dramatic, just reminders of life before the frost. It was in these quiet spaces, barely lit by embers and cloud-thwarted moonlight, that stories sprouted like prairie mushrooms. A child wondered aloud if snow could feel ticklish. Her brother suggested it was more likely that snow didn't care, being snow. The sky above had turned the sort of grey that carries secrets, and now thin flakes settled atop every surface, on barrels, boots, the sourdough jar someone had forgotten outside, soon to become a snowdough, and on the lace hat worn by Mrs. Pembleton, who insisted on sleeping upright like a creaky duchess. You closed your eyes again, though they hadn't quite opened in the first place. The wagon's sway was gentle now, rocked only by wind and the faint scurry of a mouse regretting its choices. You felt warm enough. Yes, astonishingly. If you didn't move, breathe sharply, or think too hard about your toes. They were huddled together like distant cousins at a funeral. The night promised to continue as all trail nights did. Long, cold, and filled with small, weird dreams made from whatever slipped into your sleepy brain. Fiddle notes, mule complaints, ghost towns before breakfast. But something was shifting outside. The wind had changed, just slightly. The direction, the weight, the sort of thing a seasoned frontiersman might notice while chewing on cold beans. It wasn't a threatening sound, not exactly, but just intriguing enough to make you wonder what the morning might bring when the snow finally paused to catch its breath. The wind outside had settled into that low, whispering murmur that wagons seemed to draw out of the plains, like the prairie itself was trying not to wake the sleepers. Inside the canvas cocoon of the wagon, it was slightly less whispery. Josiah's boots, drying near the stove, were issuing small, defiant puffs of sock-scented essence with every shift of the logs, which, to be honest, didn't pair well with the smoked beans and salted pork-flavoured tapestry already woven through the space. Night had fully fallen, moonlight frosting the edges of the oiled fabric overhead, and frosting, well, just about everything else. The wagon's thin wooden walls held back the snow, but stopped short at blocking the cold. Still, our travellers were luckier than some. Just a few decades earlier, and barely a day's ride west, this winter wonderland would have been called an impassable morass by a disgruntled explorer with more adjectives than rations. Louisa, curled beneath a patchwork quilt, made of everything from old flannel nightshirts to one memorable square of paisley curtains, hummed softly to herself as she tried to coax her toes back into some kind of circulation. Her lullaby of choice. Oh Susanna, though it had somehow morphed into Oh sausage, due to the lingering aroma of that unfortunate dinner. Did we ever figure out what animal that was? She murmured. Josiah, through a wool scarf wrapped generously over his nose and nearly to his forehead, replied, not sure it was an animal strictly speaking, Silas, ever the optimist, was already asleep, sprawled on a bedroll with his journal tucked like a trusted corncob pipe beneath his arm. After trying to scratch out his daily reflections by candlelight, he'd abandoned his noble quest after the inkwell froze shut. His final entry of the evening simply read, "Snow. Everywhere. Suspect toes are leaving." Outside, the snowflakes tumbled on, like nature's slowest pillow fight. Somewhere in the dark lay the scattered remains of a blackjack game that had ended abruptly when the cards turned into kindling. Nearby, their oxen stood with a patience only bovines possess, chewing quietly, swaying like woolen pendulums in the snow. Unlike humans, who require 3 layers of wool and a stern pep talk just to retain their internal organs, oxen were built for this kind of weather. They were the tundra tanks of the frontier. Within this fragile world of creaky boards and shared body heat, time took on a peculiar quality. The night didn't pass as much as meander. Hours stretched long and slow, like molasses left in cold iron kettle. The ticking of the borrowed travel clock, which only worked when it felt like it, echoed against the canvas like a heartbeat until it stopped again, likely offended by the smell. At one point, Louisa snapped upright. "Did you all hear that?" she whispered. Everyone froze. Well, everyone awake froze. Silas, deeply committed to dreamland, may have been dreaming about freezing, which sort of counts. Josiah listened for a long moment. "Reckon it was just the snow sliding off the canvas," he said. "Sounded like footsteps." "Maybe it's the wind playing tricks," he offered. "Or possibly a raccoon with ambitions." Louisa relaxed, mostly. After all, on the trail, the line between imagination and overcooked beans making rude noises in the night was gossamer thin. With her head back on the makeshift pillow, a folded buffalo robe that once belonged to an uncle with mysterious debts, she let her eyes drift closed again. In this temporary home, where the stars were your nightlight and frost made delicate ferns on the windows of your soul, or at least the canvas flap, sleep came like a slow tide. Despite the hard ground, the itchy wool, and the symphony of nighttime digestive complaints from both people and animals, there was something undeniably peaceful about it all. Wrapped in history, comforted by the crackle of a fire long since smothered, you could almost forget that you hadn't bathed since Idaho. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentle and ceaseless, each flake a glimmer of silence. And tomorrow, well, that was something worth dreaming about. The wind had an interesting way of gossiping across the prairie that night. It didn't howl. No, that was too dramatic for our scene. Instead, it murmured, as if it were trying to tell a secret to every creaking tree and every frost-dusted bison bone buried along the trail. Inside the wagon, the air smelled of kerosene, wool, and stale biscuits, a fragrance you don't usually find at high-end candle shops, but perhaps should. The canvas flaps quivered now and then, nudged sleepily by the cold breeze like a child poking a sleeping parent to say, "The stars are doing something weird again." Bertha May, who'd claimed the prime sleeping spot near the warmest part of the stove, was already snoring contentedly. Her snore had a curious rhythm, something between a squeaky stare and an indifferent moose. It was oddly reassuring, like the trail's own lullaby. Tommy, bundled in 2 quilts and a coat 4 sizes too big, mumbled from beneath a mound of patched fabric, "Do wolves like bean stew?" His question was not rhetorical. He was genuinely concerned that their dinner might turn them into bait. His mother, eyes half shut and already drifting, murmured, "They like deer, Tommy. Deer don't usually have indigestion. The stew in question had been cobbled together from beans, bacon fat, and a very confident turnip. Pioneers were nothing if not optimistic with their ingredients. It had taken 3 hours to boil, 2 hours to cool, and 19 minutes to cause minor existential crises in everyone who tasted it. But it was warm, and when you're sleeping under canvas with snowflakes the size of sequins drifting lazily from the sky, sometimes warmth is all the luxury you get. Outside, the snow was the quietest thing anyone ever heard. It landed without complaint, without hurry, laying its soft weight on the wagons, the wheel tracks, even the grumbles of tired oxen. Snow in the mid-1800s had a sort of poetry to it. It didn't pelt or punish. It whispered and waited. A white silence draped over the camp, insulating it with a kind of cold comfort. Silas, the eldest of the group and chief worrier about axle grease logistics, sat near the back of his wagon cross-legged, mending a pair of socks that had seen more dust than cotton. He hummed a hymn whose words he'd forgotten, but kept singing anyway, substituting lyrics with phrases like, "Oh Lord, bless these toes," and "May the heel hole vanish like Pharaoh's army." He wasn't particularly religious, but he did believe in warm feet. Further along the campfire ring, reduced now to a few coals glowing like lazy fireflies, old Garrett stared at the sky with his back against a barrel labelled lard, possibly. He claimed he could count the constellations even through the snowfall. "That there's the great plough," he slurred softly, pointing at a roughly shoe-shaped patch of nothing. Or maybe just a wagon top looking juicy. No one corrected him, partly out of kindness, partly because everyone else saw it too. And in all of it, the snow kept falling, gently, persistently, like history itself, not in chapters, but in moments, piling onto each other until you couldn't remember which one started it all. The children were the first to fall asleep, bundled like anxious burritos, their faces pink from the cold, and their dreams tinged with thoughts of toy-spinning tops and horses with wings made of candy. The adults followed more slowly, worn by a day of managing pickled items, wet mittens, and oxen with surprisingly firm opinions about hill gradients. And soon, the only sound in the camp was the contented crackle from the last of the embers and the soft sniffling of a raccoon, ransacking someone's soap stash. Nobody ever talks about the soap getting stolen, but it happened more than you'd think. Raccoons in the 1800s didn't know what soap was, but they were very sure they wanted it. Inside one particular wagon, Henry, who had spent most of the day arguing with a frozen axle, lay half awake, his hands still tingling from the effort. He stared at the canvas above, where a patch of starlight leaked through a tiny tear. It twinkled, delicately, in rhythm with Bertha May's snores. He smiled to himself. The trail was long, bitter, and occasionally so boring that fence posts looked exciting. But in moments like this, with snow slipping gently through the world like a dream, it was all right. Outside, the wind had taken a break from whispering scandals and now hummed something that might have been mistaken for a lullaby if you listened slow enough. And somewhere just beyond the ring of wagons, a pair of boots left fresh tracks in the snow. Not alarming ones, mind you, curious ones. After all, someone had to check on whether the raccoon found the fancy soap. As the night deepened and the snow grew thicker, the world turned softer and quieter still. Sleeping too, as if waiting for what morning would bring. The snow had finally ceased its fussy tapping against the canvas above, and in the respectful quiet that followed, the silence was so powerful that even the cold dared not interrupt. Outside, the prairie stretched beneath a fresh blanket of snowflakes, soft, shining, suspiciously like the icing on a dessert. But inside the covered wagon, it was a different kind of wilderness, a land populated by wool blankets, damp socks, and a family trying to sleep through the peculiar racket of someone trying to turn over quietly on a straw mattress. Now, if you've never tried sleeping in a primitive bunk made of questionable wood and wishful thinking, allow me to tell you, it's not for the faint of patience. Each time Martha adjusted her position, the entire wagon seemed to groan in sympathy, wood creaking like a barn owl with secrets. Her husband, Amos, remained entirely still, either in deep pioneer slumber or simply steeling himself with sheer willpower not to lecture Martha on the acoustics of rolling over. In the back corner, young Caleb insisted he was not cold, even as he wrapped his arms around a tin coffee pot for warmth. The pot had been emptied before sundown, and now served its secondary function, being slightly warmer than a snowball. "What is the likelihood," Caleb whispered into the darkness, "that this whole wagon might suddenly slide down a hill in the night?" Martha considered this a moment. "Well," she replied, "depends on whether your father remembered to chock the wheels, which, if memory serves, he was going to do right after drying the coffee pot you're currently spooning." There was a pause, a deep, meaningful pause. Amos cleared his throat in a way that definitely meant he was awake after all. "It's wedged," he said into the darkness, "behind a rock. That's better than chocks, more natural." "That's what you said about the latrine situation," Martha replied, with a warmth that can only come from true matrimonial history. It's worth noting here that frontier camping, otherwise known as daily life in the 1800s, was not a well-oiled machine of modern convenience. Nights were long, mattresses were experimental, and privacy was considered more of an Eastern luxury, like curtains or doorbells. Somewhere near the front of the wagon, their dog, half collie, half mystic Fog, let out a low sigh, the sort of sigh that suggested he too was contemplating the existential ramifications of pioneer sleeping arrangements. He turned thrice upon his patch of burlap and settled, utterly convinced he was the only sensible creature in the wagon. Outside, the snow had settled thick on the trees, which stood like ancient powdered statues advertising winter's peculiar knack for drama. Icicles reached down timidly from wagon edges, glinting in the light of a moon shyly peeking through cloud cover, as if unsure this whole frontier thing was a good idea after all. The night was not entirely a failure of sleep, though. The air inside the wagon was heavy with the smell of old wool, faint bacon, someone's forgotten boots, and a kind of quiet dignity that only comes from enduring things without complaint, or at least with complaints kept under a whisper. In truth, many settlers grew used to such nights, cold, close, and filled with equal parts discomfort and affection. There was no turning up the thermostat, no closing the window. They were the window. And yet, these tiny rolling homes had a way of nestling into the landscape like caravan snails, inching ever westward, believers in morning fires and fresh starts. Caleb, now curled into a shape that could only be described as defensive armadillo, finally dozed off, still gently embracing the coffee pot. His gentle breaths joined a nocturne of soft human sounds. Snores, sighs, the occasional muttered disagreement from the unconscious. Through it all, the canvas above fluttered softly in the mild breeze, and somewhere out in the woods, a snow-heavy branch gave way with a muted whoomp, stirring nothing but the ears of a few curious raccoons pondering the smell of cornbread. As the hours crept along, the warmth of togetherness won over the cold bite in the air. Blankets shifted, bodies adjusted. The wagon, enshrouded by snow and dreams, settled just a little deeper into the earth. And just before it was all lost to slumber, Martha cracked one eye open, whispered in the direction of her thoroughly conscious husband, "Next time, Amos, we're packing curtains." To which, in the smallest voice possible, he replied, "Noted." Outside, the night held its breath. Inside, sleep tiptoed in at last. And somewhere on the horizon, hidden beyond the reach of frost, the promise of breakfast and a half-thawed biscuit waited patiently to greet a new day. The lantern flickered low, casting long shadows on the canvas walls of the covered wagon. Outside, snow whispered onto the prairie in delicate spirals, muting the world in pale quiet. Inside, the warmth of breath and wool and a faint whiff of boiled beans hung in the air, comforting in a way that only shared hardship can be. Across the trail, other wagons had gone still. Soft lumps of life and hope huddled beneath, canvas domes. Every creak of leather harness or distant coyote call only made the silence deeper. If you listen close, you might hear old Martha Thatcher humming the opening bars of a hymn, not from piety, but habit. Or perhaps because her feet were cold, and sometimes, when you've worn the same socks for 9 days straight, and you lost the good pair to a windstorm in Nebraska, you simply turn to music. Jacob was doing his best to sleep. And by best, we mean he was lying stiff as a barn plank, furs bundled to his chin, one eye squinting toward the wagon's canvas ceiling, as if expecting answers to leak through it like snowflakes. Sleep didn't come easy on the trail. It arrived like a mule with personality, eventually with fussing, and entirely on its own schedule. Earlier that day, the oxen had slipped on a patch of ice near the river crossing, pulling the wagon on a short but memorable slide that left half the party breathless and the other half laughing in a way that said, if you didn't laugh, you'd remember you're freezing. The wheel had been fixed mostly, with rope, determination, and a healthy disregard for gravity. Tonight, though, wasn't for sliding. Tonight was for blankets and stories, and the serene kind of ache that comes from moving all day in the cold and knowing tomorrow you'll do it again. Little Penny Harper had been asking questions before bed again. She was 6.5 and deeply concerned about how Santa Claus would manage out here in the middle of all the nothing. Her mother, wise and quick on her numb toes, had reminded her that Santa always found children, even if they were half frozen, caked in mud, and temporarily residing in Iowa. Penny had accepted this cheerfully and promptly wedged herself between her two older brothers like a particularly determined corn cob snug in its husk. They were all asleep now, dreaming of candy or hay bales, or the scent of home fires in chimneys long behind them. There was an art to sleeping in a covered wagon. First, you had to ignore about 4 of your 5 senses. The unmoving lurch of the wood floor beneath you, tilted slightly from that spot you found to park on the hill, was something you'd simply pretend wasn't happening. The smell, an aromatic cocktail of livestock proximity, cooking grease, unwashed socks, and determination. Yes, you ignored that too. You learned to let go of grudges. If someone kicked you in the shin during the night because they were dreaming they were swimming, that was just part of the arrangement. Charles Avery had once punched his own cousin in a midnight bout of somnambulant log chopping. Apologies were murmured. Blanket turf was renegotiated. Life carried on. Tonight the snow muffled the world in an enchantment, From inside the wagon, it could almost be mistaken for peace, whiteness thickening in every corner, burying thoughts of the route ahead, of broken spokes, of the ever-dreaded beans again, tomorrow. The night air crept in through every seam, even with bison furs and stitched oilcloths cocooning the group. Nose tips reddened like tiny lanterns. Fingers curled around anything warm, mugs of tea each other, a dog if you were very lucky. And yet, there was comfort, a peculiar, quiet comfort in knowing every soul around you lay wrapped in the same fragile hope. Each traveller, snoring softly beside their kin and companions, shared one thought above all. Just keep going. One day, one wheel turn, one frozen morning at a time. Outside, the snow slowed, drifting lazily as if it too had grown tired of constant motion. The clouds thinned, and if one peeked outside, they might glimpse the moon, a silver coin tossed across the endless black prairie sky. Somewhere toward the rear wagons, someone coughed, then rolled over, and far off in the tinkling hush of the night, a bell rang out from the neck of a mule who'd grown tired of his own silence. The sound was small, lonesome, and oddly reassuring. Back in the depths of the wagon, Jacob finally exhaled. Perhaps the mule was right. Tomorrow would come, and it would bring its own share of bumps and noise and boots tracking in bits of the world. But tonight, just for now, there was snow and canvas and sleep if you were kind enough to close your eyes and trust. Up ahead, frost gathered ghost-like at the edges of lantern glass. Not far from the wagon's quietly creaking entrance, a peculiar kind of nightfall had taken over the prairie, as if someone had gently pulled a quilt of hush across the land. Outside, the snow floated down with all the ambition of a lazy feather, and inside the canvas-covered wagon, the air had grown thick with the kind of silence that only happens when nothing wants to move and everything wants to sleep. By this point in the evening, the beans had been eaten, the boots half kicked off, and the freezing cold had reached that particular stage where everyone's breath came out as delicate smoke signals of discomfort. The family lay bundled like overstuffed sausages inside their sleeping rolls, each one doing their best to drift off, while also weighed down by about 18 layers of wool, flannel, and wishful thinking. At the back of the wagon, Grandmother Nora was murmuring what might have been a prayer, or possibly just a stern advisory to her own knees. "Left one's been stiff since Kansas," she whispered into the dark, as though the prairie night might find that helpful. Next to her, little Uni, wrapped up tighter than a squirrel in a snowstorm, counted every creak of the wagon ribs like lullabies measured in splinters. Now, it's worth noting that sleeping in a covered wagon didn't come with a user manual, unless you counted gossip and strongly worded opinions from fellow travelers. The average wagon, also known as a prairie schooner, for its boat-like aquiline shape, was roughly the length of a modern pickup truck and about as comfortable as a picnic table on wheels. Beds were improvised, feather ticks if you were fancy, buffalo robes if you were resilient, and hay or rope-strung slings if you were both creative and unconcerned about your spine. And yet, the pioneers managed, mostly by ignoring their backs altogether. Tonight, like every night on the trail, the wind demanded to be noticed. It slithered through gaps in the canvas like a nosy neighbor and rattled the cowbells with the spooky elegance of a bored ghost. A pot lid clanged behind the wagon. Something thudded, probably a chicken protesting the incompetence of her perch. In another wagon nearby, someone began snoring with fierce commitment. Possibly two people, possibly a person and a donkey attempting to harmonize. The trail, for all its hardship, had rhythm. From the outside, a sleeping wagon might resemble a lumpy loaf of bread with tiny holes of glowing warmth. Lantern light flickering through moth-nibbled seams. Inside, time slowed down to the pace of a rocking chair dream. Folk who'd fought sleet storms and muddy ravines by day now huddled under quilts pieced together from old shirts and better intentions, limbs curling inward as if protecting the softest parts of hope. For some, dreams came quickly. Pioneers dreamed of land so fertile you could plant fence posts and grow a whole corral. Others dreamed more modestly, of potatoes or washing their hair without having to break ice first. That sort of dream could cradle you gently through the darkest prairie nights. Of course, not everyone slept peacefully. There's always one soul who feared, not unreasonably, that wolves might mistake the wagon for a rather delicious burrito. Tonight, it was Uncle Asa, who insisted on sleeping with his boots on and one eye open. He'd once claimed to have stared down a coyote merely by quoting Leviticus. The coyote, in all fairness, had simply blinked and walked off. But Asa still felt it was a victory of scripture over fur. Luckier sleepers could be lulled by the thump-thump of the oxen's distant snorts. Some found comfort in the fact that their breath was visible, as if the night were constantly reminding them they were still here, still exhaling, still pressing onward. Far off, beyond the circle of wagons and the thin crackle of campfires reduced to ash and ember, the landscape sagged beneath the weight of snowfall. Buffalo grass bowed in reverence to winter. Low ridges glistened in moonlight like hunched shoulders wrapped in silver shawls. And up above, ever faithful, a sky of stars gave its silent benediction. No matter how cold things got, the universe didn't close shop. Back within the canvas womb of the wagon, the warmth of shared body heat had finally started doing its modest magic. Junie stopped counting creaks. Asa's eye fluttered shut, boots still solidly in place, and grandmother's knees fell silent, or at least quieter. Out there in the dark, the long trail still waited, but tonight, under that steady fall of winter's hush, the weary travelers slept, in dreams stitched with courage, tedium, and an honest hunger for tomorrow's horizon. And just as the lantern's glow gave way to softer shadows, the night offered up one final sound, the gentle crunch of distant footsteps, unfamiliar, muffled by snow. The wind had settled into a careful hush by the time the stars made their full entrance, tiptoeing across the sky like polite guests at a winter cotillion. Snowflakes blustered slower now, their grand ambitions crumbling into soft sighs. Inside the covered wagon, the canvas stretched tightly above like a frost-kissed ceiling, and the little group of travelers had long given up pretending anyone would truly sleep. Not with the cold worming its way into every blanket fold and boot heel, especially not with Horace having developed a rather unfortunate chili-based snore. The fire outside crackled low, casting long shadows of the wagon wheels onto the snowdrifts. Thick, uneven lines danced, a silent puppet theatre lit by embers and the occasional spark. The night was too cold for coyotes to do much howling, and even the wolves must have been curled somewhere wondering what foolish human enterprise could possibly require this much snow plodding and wagon jostling. They had a point. Inside the wagon, Henrietta Bloom reclined against a sack of dried beans, which, though completely unsuitable as a pillow, did provide a certain sense of firm moral support. Her bonnet was halfway over her eyes, more of a fashion choice than a functional one at this hour. "You ever think about chimneys?" she asked aloud, to no one and everyone. Young Emery, whose age hovered somewhere between uses his own toothbrush and counts with fingers, blinked sleepily from under 2 wool blankets. "What about 'em?" he murmured. "They just let all the heat float up and away. Not a bright idea when you think about it. But because they're made of brick, we let them get away with it." There was a pause. Emery mulled this over. Maybe the smoke needs somewhere to go. Henrietta regarded him, impressed. "Well now, that's an answer I'll accept." Somewhere on the tailgate end of the wagon, Dutch, the farmhand with a talent for cigar rolling and unsolicited facts about hoofed mammals, grunted. That's why old pioneer stoves didn't waste heat. They'd build up mass around the firebox, think iron or stone, to store the warmth and radiate all night. Henrietta was silent for a moment. "Dutch, that's actually helpful." "I'm full of architectural wonder," Dutch said, drifting back into snores almost immediately. Of course, not every wagon on the trail fared so cozy. In 1856, the Willie and Martin handcart companies had found themselves caught in snowstorms much like this one. But unlike our current travelers, who still had salted pork, some reasonably trustworthy mules, and at least 3 people who could start a fire without involving divine intervention, those groups were gravely underprepared. With too few supplies and too much hope, they found themselves in an early snow with nearly 1,000 miles to go. Some froze, others suffered frostbite so severe they later appeared in newspapers for having survived it. The rest, they became quiet legends in family lore, remembered each time a modern oven proved too slow. This night, by some glimmer of good fortune or just luck, disguised as beef tallow, the group had remembered to grease the wagon wheels before sunset. The wheel grease, typically made from animal fat or lard-like concoctions, helped avoid the kind of squealing that could put your nerves on the defensive, not to mention attract unwanted lupine attention. Greased wheels, silent night. It was a solid deal. Outside, the oxen huddled in their sleep, occasionally snorting mist into the crisp air. Good oxen, these. No one had named them yet, partially because bestowing a name upon a working animal was seen as the fast track to emotional attachment. And emotional attachment was unwise when stew was still a possibility. Still, a few of them had earned nicknames anyway. Soggy, for instance, because he once fell into a river and came out looking like a cider-soaked carpet. Inside, the air had grown warmer through condensation, so that now some of the family's coats hung on pegs to dry by the lantern's gentle light. Molly, the matriarch, busied herself mindfully with a journal tucked beneath her makeshift bedroll. Her pen scratched quietly, recording the day. 15 miles walked, 1 shoelace snapped, 1 sighting of what may have been a bear, or possibly just Finch in his buffalo hide coat. Hard to tell when the sun's already on sabbatical. "Anyone got more coffee grounds?" asked Finch from beneath a heavy stack of quilts. "We're going to sleep, not raise the dead," Molly replied, tapping the end of her pen thoughtfully. The wagon groaned as a gust pressed against its flank. Emery shifted and pulled his extra sock hat lower over his ears. A little silence passed. Fat snowflakes tapped against the canvas as softly as distant applause. The fire outside sighed once more, and with the wind changed only slightly, the wagon began to sway just a little, like a cradle in a world made entirely of frozen lace and half-forgotten dreams. Sleep was still a suggestion, rather than a fact, but in that gentle, irresistible way of long nights and long roads, it began to drift in anyway. The wind had a habit of snaking through the tiniest seams in prairie canvas, like a persistent cat with chilly paws. Somewhere between Missouri gumption and the Wyoming skyline, the covered wagon had become less of a traveling home and more of a flapping, creaky refrigerator on wheels. The snow had settled in like an uninvited relative, quiet, heavy, and determined to stay longer than anyone wanted. And as night deepened, the pioneers of this westward wander found themselves engaged in a particularly futile exercise, trying to stay warm using only buffalo hides, tepid cornmeal mush, and optimism. Inside one of the wagons, sardined between sacks of beans and something that might once have been a bonnet, Henry Grigsby lay on his back, contemplating the ceiling of canvas above him as it swayed like a ghost's laundry line. Henry had always fancied himself a hardy soul, until he realized winter on the trail had no interest in his romantic notions of manifest destiny. His feet, despite being wrapped in a creative amalgamation of wool, flannel, and what he was reasonably sure was one of their dish rags, had turned into reluctant ice sculptures. The wagon moaned and shifted slightly as the wind whistled its prairie opera. A nearby cow lowed mournfully, no doubt lamenting the stark difference between this expedition and the brochure that had surely promised abundant grass, mild weather, and zero existential crises. Henry reached for the heat source nearest him, his cousin Opal, already wrapped in 2 shawls and the firm belief that she had married beneath her station. She did not appreciate the gesture. "Stop poking," she muttered, in the tone of someone who had not slept in 2 days and could name each of her 34 mosquito bites individually. "I wasn't poking, Opal," Henry whispered. "It's my foot, I swear." "Well, then your foot's poking. Tell it to knock it off." Henry sighed and resignedly accepted that physical warmth was not to be found here. Perhaps mental warmth then. He focused on the fire they'd left dying a few feet outside the wagon, a sputtering commemoration to what logs they hadn't already burned in desperation. He thought about the flames' dance, the crackle that sounded like tiny applause for simply surviving another mile, another day, another fall into the soup pot. Winter travel in the 1840s did not lend itself to comfort, you see. Along the winding trails westward, snowdrifts often found a cozy resting place inside the very wagons meant to protect from them. Tarpaulin patches helped until they didn't. Fires were a constant risk near the canvas walls. Burn down your wagon or freeze your bones. Those were often the binary choices. And while some nights the group huddled together for warmth, inevitably someone snored like a walrus or woke up declaring impending doom from a dream that sounded suspiciously like last week's cooking accident. In times like this, conversation did the heavy lifting of keeping spirits afloat. During the day, the group might have passed the time recounting tales of towns they'd left, neighbors they didn't miss, and food they hoped to see again. At night, the tone turned more philosophical. How cold was too cold for one's soup to be considered a weapon? Could someone catch consumption merely by spelling it slowly? And above all, would the oxen feel offended if given knit caps? Tonight, though, conversation was scarce. Tongues and tempers had both gone brittle in the frost. Only the occasional mumble broke the hush, a shuffle from a restless sleeper, or a tooth chattering in soliloquy. Henry closed his eyes, trying to remember warmer days. July in St. Louis, the air thick with river-misted heat, and the illusion that this journey might feel like a grand picnic on wheels. That illusion had frozen to death somewhere around Fort Laramie. Outside, snowflakes twirled like sleepy stars falling toward the earth, where they landed muffled and silent, settling into every crease and gap between canvas and imagination. The wagon groaned again as a pine cone tumbled from a nearby tree and struck its side. That was enough to wake Abigail Sampson, who had the constitution of a squirrel and the bladder capacity of a hummingbird. "Oh no," came her whisper. "Not again." Henry groaned louder than he meant to, but before any boundary disputes or frosty negotiations could resume, the wind began to calm, just slightly. The snow softened. The darkness grew deeper, more velvety somehow. And far off in the trees, an owl announced its opinion of the whole endeavor with a single, judgmental hoot. The wagon wasn't comfortable, nor much warmer. But for Henry, sleep was finally tiptoeing closer, perhaps tired of eavesdropping on arguments about poking feet and the metaphysics of stew. And just as eyelids began to sink, the distant sound of a tree branch cracking under snow echoed gently down the hillside, a sleepy reminder that the woods had stories too. Snow had a way of making the world go quiet, as if even chaos itself had tucked in for the evening. Beneath the soft canvas of the covered wagon, our little travelling band of dreamers and draft animals had settled into a tentative sort of peace. The only sounds were the occasional shifting of hooves on frozen earth, and the melodic wheeze of someone named Ephraim snoring like a blacksmith's bellows caught in a blizzard. The wagon creaked with each gust of wind, a tired old companion too stubborn to shiver, too weathered to complain. If wagons had emotions, and who's to say they don't, this one would have been equal parts stoic and sarcastic. It had seen things. It had carried whole lives across plains, deserts, and mountain passes, and right now it was just trying not to freeze its axles off. Inside, we were bundled in more layers than an onion with trust issues: quilts, hides, wool shawls, and 2 spirited chickens who had staged a minor rebellion against sleeping in the coop. They perched imperiously on the end of Anna May's blanket, making disapproving clucking sounds every time the wind whistled. These were attitude-rich poultry with frontier grit and no regard for personal space. Our conversation had dwindled to murmurs, those half-dreaming ramblings people share when they're too tired to be interesting, but too cold to fall asleep. Someone had asked earlier if snow could think. Another wanted to know what beaver pelt smelled like when wet, which we all wisely chose to ignore. The fire outside had finally surrendered to the elements, leaving behind a heap of faintly glowing coals and a singed coffee kettle that now resembled something excavated from Pompeii. Staring into it, Thomas had waxed poetic about mankind's eternal battle with nature and how coffee, especially coffee gone cold, was proof we were losing. Now we lay in that quiet hour, not yet asleep, not truly awake. It was a sort of liminal peace, the kind that only came when every muscle is tired, every story has been told twice, and even your complaints are too lazy to form sentences. The wind made a curious sort of lullaby as it danced across the frozen prairie. It slithered into cracks and corners like a ghost still learning its trade. It wasn't fierce anymore, just persistent, the way a child keeps asking why until you admit you don't actually know how butter is churned. We were camped near what passed for a grove in that part of the world, 4 trees and an optimistic bush, hoping the sparse foliage might break the wind. It didn't. But pioneers, much like possums and overconfident barbers, lived on hope. Somewhere outside, the oxen shifted, letting out great steaming huffs that blew into the night air like dragons in winter exile. Those beasts were the unsung heroes of the whole endeavor. They didn't complain, didn't run off, and didn't require payment beyond hay and the occasional affectionate slap on the haunch. History books tend to focus on the people who settled the West, but there's a strong case to be made that it was oxen who truly hauled civilization across the continent. Either that, or stubbornness itself. Inside our canvas cocoon, Anna May had begun humming something. A wordless tune passed through generations without ever bothering to get proper lyrics. It was likely something her grandmother had learned back in Virginia, maybe even something hummed during the Revolution, while waiting for shoe leather to tenderize over a fire. Music, like hunger and sarcastic chickens, knows no era. Across the darkness, someone sighed. It may have been contentment. It may have been indigestion. It didn't matter. We were warm enough. We were alive. And despite the snow, the wind, and the general madness of traveling hundreds of miles with no guarantee the destination would be better than the place we'd left, we were, in some small and peculiar way, content. The prairie night held us in its quiet grasp, stars hidden behind slate-colored clouds. Time felt soft here, like cornmeal biscuits baked over low heat. Tomorrow would bring more wagon wheels, more creaks, more snow perhaps, and likely more complaints about the coffee. But for now, under quilts and feathers, and the defiant warmth kindled only by shared breath and proximity, we rested. And just beyond the edge of sleep, a low rumble began. A promise, or maybe a problem. Only the horizon would answer. There was a particular kind of silence that came with snow on the plains, one that swallowed even the creaks of the wagon wheels and the distant whinnies of horses settling under makeshift canvas lean-tos. The fire had long since dwindled to quiet coals, sneaking up smoke like bashful ghosts, and the starless sky was thick with the hush of falling flakes. It wasn't darkness that surrounded the wagon. It was softness. Inside, cloaked in quilts and layered like a lasagna of wool and flannel, the family lay packed more tightly than a sardine family reunion. Blankets tucked beneath chins, frosty breath rising in slow clouds. At the far end of the wagon was Grandpa Moses, who was known for two things: an intimate knowledge of 1830s Missouri politics, and a snore so aggressive it could cause squirrels to abandon their trees. "Is that a buffalo?" young Silas had once whispered, wide-eyed in the night, as the low rumble of Grandpa's nasal performance shook the wagon's canvas. "No, son," his father replied, already half asleep, but close. Tonight, however, even the familiar snorts and grumbles seemed muffled by the snow, which had layered itself like a thick felt quilt over every sound, every sharp edge of prairie life. And with the cold came not just discomfort, but invention. Take, for instance, the bed warmers. Many wagon families swore by them. And no, these weren't the generously snoring grandfathers or the dogs permitted under the covers on the coldest nights. Bed warmers were often metal pans filled with hot coals, slid between the sheets like a particularly suspicious pizza. The concept was genius, until someone misjudged the coal ratio. Then you had a fire hazard that felt like cuddling a dragon. The Johnson family, ever risk-averse, had taken to filling glass bottles with boiled water and wrapping them in trousers. Volcanic shins, they called it. A nightly ritual of guessing just how long it would take for the heat to turn your toes from icicles back to meat. Outside, icicles had begun to form along the edges of the wagon canvas, glimmering in moonlight not quite visible. Snowfall at night in the high plains was a slow procession, shy, steady, hypnotic. With each gentle drift, the world grew quieter, as though the snow were politely requesting that everyone and everything simply rest. The oxen nearby shuffled every so often, perhaps dreaming of summer grass, or perhaps grumbling about their lot in a world where their companions got beef stew and they got oats and eternal labour. No newspaper in 1853 would publish an op-ed by an ox, but if they had, the editorial title might have been something like "Hooves Tired, Spirit Weary, a Call for Equal Snack Rights." Little Liddy, only 6 and famously impervious to cold or scents, had insisted on keeping her ragdoll wrapped up so tightly in scraps of flannel and old waistcoats that it now resembled a Victorian mummy. "She gets colder than I do," Liddy had explained earnestly, watching the snow from a crack in the wagon's flap. "She don't got any bones." Bone presence, or the lack thereof, was not, to be fair, part of the official temperature regulation methods taught in those days. But when you're 6 and sharing a wagon the size of a small rowing boat with 6 family members, judgment calls are allowed to be whimsical. And yet, amid all the cold and crowding, there was something soothing in it. The sound of contented breathing. The way quilts tucked into corners mimicked the careful folds of snowy hills outside. How the lantern, now extinguished, had thrown one last flicker like a wink before letting darkness take over. The trail, these nights, didn't feel like a place at all, but more like a season of its own. Something between autumn's goodbye and springtime's hopeful hum. In this in-between, where the stove had long gone cold and the night had folded itself around them like a second blanket, sleep came not suddenly, but like a slow drift off an ed, much like the snow, never hurrying, never stopping. And while tomorrow might bring more challenges, broken axles or runaway pies, tonight was simply snowy, still, and stitched together with the worn fabric of family warmth. Somewhere near the canvas wall, a mouse made the faintest sound, perhaps plotting its noble attempt to steal a breadcrumb, or more likely, wondering why humans slept in wheeled coffins that rocked every time someone sneezed. Outside, snowflakes continued their silent reunion with the earth, and inside, the wagon grew heavier with dreams. Dreams of something warmer maybe, or at least boots that didn't leak. But before the first glow of dawn, something else stirred. Not a person, but a quiet sense that the trail itself had one more wintry surprise in store. Sometimes, when you're enveloped in the still hush of a snowy frontier night, wedged between a wool blanket that smells like wet sheep and a cousin who snores like a moose with a head cold, your mind begins to wander. A covered wagon, though romantic from afar, makes for an alarmingly unsymmetrical bed. The pitch of the wheels and the slope of the uneven prairie combine to deliver the nightly sensation that you are forever about to roll slowly downhill, which, to be fair, may have been true. Wilhelmina Atwater, age 43, mother of 6, guardian of the coffee pot, and jury foreman of the wagon's kitchen justice system, had settled into her quilted domain with all the dignity of a queen cramming into a biscuit tin. Her feet, encased in knit socks that had seen better centuries, pressed firmly against a box of pickled beets. Her head rested on a pillow that was, in fact, last week's laundry. Nothing quite sees frontier bedtime like falling asleep on a pair of trousers that witnessed several regrettable stew incidents. She wasn't alone in her discomfort. The entire wagon had descended into the peculiar silence of settlers trying not to complain. A harmony of restrained groans, soft rustling, and the occasional curse whispered politely into a homespun handkerchief echoed like a lullaby. Outside, snowflakes fell as delicately as if heaven had shaken a feather pillow. And if there was one small blessing in that vast wilderness, it was that snow muffled the night sounds. Coyotes, creaky trees, and especially the eternal thwomp of Jedediah's nasal trumpet. Now, we pause, just briefly, for a word about snow. To the pioneers, snow was not merely frozen water, but an all too persistent house guest. It provided neither decent company nor warm conversation, and unlike a rude uncle from Syracuse, you couldn't just ask it to leave after 2 days. No, snow settled in, made a mess of everything, and insisted on slipping down your collar when you went outside to use the makeshift bucket bathroom. A nighttime excursion accompanied by socked feet, a lantern, and a prayer. Back in the wagon, Elijah, aged 12 and full of opinions, had positioned himself beneath the second shelf, face to face with a cabbage that was by now more blacksmith-colored than green. He declared quietly into the night, "If I fall asleep next to this vegetable one more night, I'm going to name him and make him my lawyer." His mother shushed him with the practiced efficiency of 43 sleep-deprived nights and a spoon she kept in her pocket just in case arguments turned kinetic. Somewhere near the axle, Great Uncle Hiram let loose a snore so robust it rattled a can of condensed milk off the ledge into someone's boots. No one stirred. The wagon life gave rise to a kind of resignation, a middle ground between enlightenment and one's spinal disc quietly exiting the premises. But even among stiff joints, cabbage lawsuits, and snowflake invasions, there was a wordless sort of peace. There in the canvas cocoon, warmed by proximity and whatever body heat a baked potato could transfer back to your ribs, families found a curious kind of comfort. Laying shoulder to elbow and foot to lumbar, they shared stories, reassurances, and most of each other's ankles. At one point, the wind shifted, and there was a faint scent of pine outside, or at least a smell that resembled pine if pine took a long walk through a buffalo herd. Still, it brought with it a flicker of optimism. Perhaps tomorrow the trail would be clearer. Perhaps the oxen would not attempt mutiny. Perhaps someone might find the good coffee beans that had been missing since Nebraska. As the fire's glow outside diminished to mere amber slivers beneath the snowy hush, the pioneer's breathing slowed. Dreams drifted into minds half wrapped in flannel and half lost in hope. And as Wilhelmina shifted one final time, nudging her pickled beet suitcase further away from her pillow trousers, she murmured to herself, "Next time we bring 2 wagons, one for eating, one for sleeping, and maybe one for just escaping." The snow thickened outside, heavy in the sky, soft on the earth, as somewhere in the distance, a very determined squirrel tried to start a fight with a lantern. And inside that humble timber frame bubble of warmth and chaos, the night carried on. Up ahead on the trail waited a most curious encounter with something no one had expected. And perhaps something not entirely human. Somewhere between drifting snowflakes and drifting thoughts, the wagon creaked a little to the left. Or was that the wind tricking our weary ears again? No matter. It happened so often that, by now, most travelers on the Oregon Trail had learned to tell dreams from draft horses only about half the time. Inside the covered wagon, the air was heavy with the mixed perfume of old bacon grease, boiled wool, hay-stuffed bedding, and the unmistakable tang of cold, damp boots. Because, of course, someone had forgotten to put them outside again. Likely Edmund, a good-hearted man, full of potatoes and mistakes. As night deepened and snow tapped politely at the canvas cover, the family of 5, 6, if we count Harold the chicken, who by now was certainly part of tax records, adjusted themselves into sleep-worthy positions that were anything but. The wagon bench became a pillow. A burlap sack stuffed with last summer's dried apples served as a knee rest. Jonathan, the eldest child, made the strategic choice to burrow sideways beneath the flour barrel, citing warmth and a personal disregard for gravity. Outside, in the quiet of the prairie, the snow fell like sugar over a sleepy tablecloth. Gentle, slow, and indifferent to schedules. Coyotes occasionally harmonized in the distance, likely auditioning for one another's attention. The oxen, those unsung heroes of plodding perseverance, stood motionless under knitted shawls made of frost, breathing small, concerned clouds into the moonlight. Inside the wagon, Mrs. Callahan whispered a long sentence in the general direction of her children. Something about next spring's planting and not stepping on the last biscuit if they got up before dawn. It was a mother's form of poetry, vague, threatening, nurturing. The children, already 50% asleep, murmured agreement into their patchwork quilts. The night was long, as nights on the trail were prone to be, stretched out across the prairie like a lazy giant's nap. And yet, for all its length, it had its moments of charm. Like when little Ruth sleep-talked herself into a make-believe tea party with President Polk, she assured him his tie was crooked. Or when Harold the chicken, roosting comfortably atop the family's spare bonnet box, emitted a self-satisfied cluck as if to say, "I've seen better coops, but this'll do for now." By the flicker of their lard lamp, cheerier than a candle, and positively radiant compared to regret, the pages of an old almanac curled in the cold. Inside was weather data from 3 years ago, and a smiley sketch of a turnip drawn by someone in a moment of vegetable-based boredom. Everyone had that one friend who doodled root vegetables when restless. Tonight's quiet was not absolute. Rather, it was busy with the kind of tiny sounds that signify comfort. The shushing of wind against the canvas walls, the slow blink sigh of a baby asleep on his father's chest, the tiny creak of wood settling into itself, like an old man in a favorite chair. Even the wagon's iron nails, each one hammered in hastily before departure from Missouri, seemed to hold their breath in the hush, hoping they didn't pop loose in the cold. Snowflakes pressed more firmly now upon the wagon's roof, and the world outside grew softer under their influence. Boots left half buried outside formed miniature mountain ranges, while the campfire, long since surrendered to the snow, sent up its final feather of smoke, a signal perhaps to the stars that all was settled below. And as the warmth from woolen layers and a shared body heat turned the wagon into a kind of low-grade sauna powered entirely by potatoes and familial closeness, most inside slipped deeper into sleep. Their dreams slipped too, off westward, past the edge of the known map, past whatever rivers they had yet to ford and bridges they hadn't yet built. There wasn't much to do at that hour but sleep and trust the oxen not to develop existential angst overnight and leave. It had happened once to a family called the Smythes, whose team had wandered off toward Kansas out of what some still claim was artistic difference. But for our weary travelers, all was calm. All was stone soup and muffled snoring. And with each snowflake, the world outside layered one lazy winter lullaby over the last. Somewhere out there, just beyond the wagons, a lost bonnet fluttered quietly from a tree limb, waiting, like so many things on the trail, to be discovered in the soft light of morning. By the time the snow had formed a crusty white frosting over the entire camp, the fire had dwindled into a glowing purr of embers, nestled low in its pit like a cat, curling into itself for a final nap. The wind had hushed for the moment, perhaps taking pity on the human beings lined up like burritos under canvas and crude quilts inside their traveling tin can of a wagon. Inside, the wagon was dark, except for the flicker of a lantern turned low, a golden moth circling the damp corners, spilling enough light to see wool stockings hanging from the bowled-in ribs of the wagon frame, all sagging like surrendering flags, wet socks, cold hands, and a collective hope that tomorrow someone would find their sense of direction bundled up under a buffalo robe. Hiram, the patriarch of this plucky little caravan, and man of infinite optimism and zero navigational accuracy, was lying on his side, his elbow jammed inconveniently into a crate of pickles. His attempts to reposition himself only made the crate creak in protest and resulted in an accidental pickled pillow, which, historically speaking, has never caught on as a sleeping aid. "Isn't it something?" he whispered to his wife Susanna, who was trying to shape her bonnet into a sort of sleep mask for psychological comfort. How the stillness out there makes the wagon creak louder somehow, like it's got secrets it's trying to confess. "Maybe it's just trying to apologize," she muttered, pulling the bonnet tighter. Outside, the snowflakes fell fat and slow, as if the clouds had eaten too much molasses at supper and couldn't be bothered to rush it. Every now and then, one could imagine they heard the snap of a rabbit's paw against frosted grass, or the utterly unhurried sigh of a pine tree shrugging off its snowy shawl. Somewhere under the canvas roof, young Elijah shuffled in his blankets, clutching a wooden horse carved by a cousin who'd stayed behind in Ohio with all the deeper thinkers and dry walls. Elijah's dreams tonight danced somewhere between stagecoaches and dragons, largely influenced by the evening's tale of St. George, as retold by Uncle Silas, in a tone suspiciously reminiscent of recent dinner disasters. Another creak, then a clatter. Maggie, the family dog stuffed somewhere near the base of the barrel that served as winter pantry and pioneering ottoman, gave a single disinterested huff. In pioneering times, a dog's bark was a big deal. It meant bear or burglar or squirrel with swagger. This was none of those. Maggie was certain. She rolled onto her back, legs twitching faintly in pursuit of something dreamlike and aggravating, perhaps a squirrel with a lawyer. Hiram gently lifted the wagon flap nearest his feet to peer outside. The world had turned theatrical. White snow cascading under moonlight, trees posturing in barren elegance, and the trail behind barely visible under nature's quiet erasure. He let the flap fall back into place with the gentleness of a bishop placing a biscuit. "Hard to believe we're half a nation from where we began," he murmured to no one in particular, "and only 3 feet from the pickle crate." Susanna, who had turned her bonnet inside out for variation, rolled to face him and said, "At this rate, we'll be eating pickles until California." "Could be worse," Hiram said. "Could have lasted on hardtack." They shared a moment of understanding, acknowledging that hardtack, aka tooth-murdering biscuits, was less of a meal and more of a gritty personal trial offered in moments of extreme despair or culinary absence. Elsewhere in the wagon, someone snored like a sleepy saw working its way through a stubborn pine log, and someone else responded with a karate-like flick of quilt and elbow. Such was night diplomacy on the trail. Above, the moon moved like a watchful librarian, nodding approval at all settled souls and ensuring no one's notebook of dreams got too noisy. Somewhere near the tongue of the wagon, ice crystals gathered like nosy crystals tend to do, whispering of overnight frost and hinting at another morning of boot struggles and mittens mysteriously misplaced. But for now, the night offered merciful stillness. The sag of the canvas above them, the gentle clinks of cooling pans outside, the good old snap of tired bones reluctant to relax. It was all part of the midwinter lullaby written for covered wagons and unsung heroes with sore feet. In the cradle of wooden slats and quilt bundles, people let go of distance, ache, and weather reports. Dreams drew near, wearing buffalo coats and carrying tails tucked in their sleeves. One such story, it seemed, was just about to unfold with a knock, a whistle, and a misplaced pot lid outside in the snow-drenched silence. The wind, on that peculiar wintry prairie night, had settled into a low, sleepy sigh, less rattling, more murmuring now, as if even the atmosphere had grown drowsy. Snowflakes drifted downward with all the urgency of a tired traveller lowering themselves into a featherbed. Inside the canvas-curtained cave of the covered wagon, the world had drawn its blankets a bit tighter. Martha Preston, wrapped in 2 petticoats, a flannel shawl, and what could only generously be termed a quilt, though it resembled more of a patchwork suggestion of warmth, was still struggling to sleep, one might think, after a day of trudging across rutted earth behind oxen whose own dreams may well have been hoof-shaped and hay-scented. That slumber would come as swiftly as a hiccup, and yet, no. The wagon creaked. The boards beneath her hip whispered ancient oak complaints, and beside her, young Timothy was snoring in rhythmic reverberations that seemed to be pulled directly from one of Beethoven's lesser-known symphonies, for livestock and harmonica. Outside, the occasional flicker of a campfire ember tried to remember something. It didn't quite succeed, but it burned anyway, just a little longer. Now, people often have a very particular idea of what 1840s wagon life was like. Romantic landscapes, rugged adventure, a kind of manifest destiny bravado, filled with harmonicas, buffalo sightings, and wistful horizon gazing. What our history textbooks never tell us is that much of the pioneering spirit involved trying not to freeze your stockings off while someone in your party unintentionally ingested slightly undercooked beans for the 4th night in a row. Indeed, digestion was the true frontier. At this particular hour, the wagon's small stove, a feat of glorious impracticality, offered a heat radius equivalent to that of a determined candle in a cathedral. Still, it ticked and clinked with cozy insistence, like an old uncle who had far too many opinions about split-rail fences and wasn't afraid to share them by the fireside. Samuel, the patriarch of this weather-battered band, lay flat on his back with his breeches as a pillow and the back of his head balanced on what had once been the family Bible, but was now serving a dual role as both spiritual guide and lumbar support. He murmured sporadically in his sleep, mostly muttering phrases like, "Turn the wheel to the left, you nincompoop," which suggested he was dreaming of both wagon repair and, as ever, the village blacksmith who had once stolen his lunch in 1834. Beyond the comforting snore, chatter, and crackle of the miniature stove, the occasional distant howl reminded folks they were still very much guests on this land. Wolves, likely. Or perhaps just an ambitious raccoon trying out its falsetto. Hard to say. Wilderness sound identification was more art than science, especially with ears half frozen and muffled by knit caps. Ah, and there was Wilhelmina, the family chicken, which, despite expectations, had integrated herself into wagon life as though she were born to it. Nestled in a felt-lined basket with all the regal entitlement of a pet Pomeranian, Wilhelmina emitted a sleepy cluck now and then, as if keeping time. Her egg count had dropped significantly since the snows began, but morale higher than ever. And so they laid there, Samuel, Martha, Timothy, Wilhelmina, and the collective dream of not waking up coated in frost. The canvas flapped softly overhead, rocking the wagon's ribs like a cradle built for wayward hopes. Somewhere through the curtain of night and snow, another wagon wheel creaked in the distance, a lullaby of civilization inching westward. The scent of the previous evening's ash still hung faintly in the air, smoky, pine-tinged, and lightly seasoned with the lingering guilt of overcooked squirrel. Cooking on the trail had its own ineffable learning curve. For example, spices were rare, enthusiasm less so. In the upside-down economy of the trail, one cinnamon stick could be bartered for 3 rabbits and a back rub. Back inside the wagon, Samuel snorted once, rolled over to his other side, and accidentally elbowed Martha. She, in response, issued a sigh that said, without words, "When this is all done, I'm buying a proper feather bed if I have to rob a general store with a spoon." As the cold sharpened its chill, just the tiniest bit, nothing aggressive, just a gentle reminder, it crept through the seams like a gossipy whisper. And yet, no one stirred, not even Wilhelmina, who had somehow wrapped her little claw around the edge of a sock dangling nearby. Territorial instinct, no doubt. And so the wagon creaked, slept, dreamed. The prairie snored back. Tomorrow would come with the promise of another day's stumble across snow-drowsy earth. But for now, the night was kind, the snow was soft, and the great, unspeakably cold future could wait. Just a little longer. The wind was still whispering like a nervous librarian as night deepened over the prairie, brushing loose snowflakes against the canvas sides of the covered wagon with the gentlest sort of insistence. It wasn't quite a storm, no, more like a polite snowflake symposium, where each flake had turned up fashionably late and made its way quietly into the gathering. Inside the wagon, the air was warmer than you'd expect, thanks to the collective breath of 4 uneasy sleepers and one alarmingly flatulent mule named Cicero parked nearby, whom no one had had the courage to mention. It was in these chilled, quiet hours that the trail's strangest thoughts came out to stretch their legs. Blankets rustled like distant thunder lost in the hills, and somewhere under a buffalo robe, young Eli, the self-appointed assistant wagon leader, a title he had awarded himself with absolutely no ceremony, was pondering the curious physics of frozen beans. Earlier that evening, they'd managed to coax a fire to life, and supper had consisted of beans, salt pork, and hopes. The beans, it turned out, were as hard as optimism in February. No one said it out loud. Of course, trail etiquette dictated that criticism of beans, boots, or blisters be kept strictly internal. But it was very much thought. Mrs. Morgan seemed to be sleeping, tucked beside her snoring husband like an exasperated bookend. Her bonnet hung from a nail above her by some quiet miracle of balance and overlooked dignity. She had a knack for sleeping straight-backed, forearms crossed over her chest, as though posing for a statue titled Mildly Disappointed Matron. No one dared disturb her. Not even the occasional mouse that scampered beneath the wagon dared break her repose. Just beyond the thin slice of canvas wall, the prairie stretched out, moonlit and drowsy, dusted in white. Somewhere out there, a solitary coyote commented faintly on the state of the Union, though his speech consisted mostly of howls and one particularly enthusiastic yip. The sound drifted over the plains, part lonely serenade and part warning to any creature still awake enough to care. Inside, Pi was trying to sleep with his boots on. Again, he claimed it was strategic, just in case a surprise cattle stampede chose that precise moment to burst through the ghostly quiet. But everyone knew it was actually because he'd thrown his socks too close to the fire earlier, and they now resembled charred cedar planks with ambitions of becoming smells. Under her own wool blanket, Letty was awake. Not worried, not restless, just marvelling. Not at the snowflakes, though they were lovely. Not at the stars, though they winked down like nervous jesters. No, she was marvelling at the fact that she and one rickety wagon were standing still in a place no map had ever quite defined. Halfway between nowhere and next, surrounded by nothing but prairie and promise. It was almost beautiful. If you could ignore the frozen water droplets, the solidified beans, and the occasional nighttime proclamation of Cicero the mule, you might say it was even peaceful. Out on the edge of the wagon, encampment, where a line of wooden-spoked wheels stood half buried in soft snow, a lantern still glowed. Old Micah, the unofficial sage of oxen and poorly timed jokes, had fallen asleep mid-whittling. His latest creation, apparently a squirrel, though early guesses had included cloud and piece of wood, had slipped from his hand and come to rest gently in his beard, which by now had enough twigs and resin to qualify as its own wilderness. The snow kept falling, each flake as silent as a secret. The fire had long gone out, leaving glimmering embers that blinked like forgotten campfire stories. Above, the constellations drifted slowly westward, ancient and mutely amused. Not a voice spoke, not even the wind dared to raise itself above a whisper now. The covered wagon rocked almost imperceptibly with the wind, like a cradle designed for dreamers, creaking just once for good measure. Somewhere, someone murmured in their sleep, possibly in protest of the beans, possibly to negotiate with the gods of cold feet. And yet, despite everything, the odd symphony of nighttime noises, the chill, the low-grade bean-related regret, the silence gradually deepened into the sort of quiet that feels like a lullaby you don't remember learning. Far off, a new snow cloud gathered low on the horizon, puffing itself up as though preparing for something, though whether a playful flurry or another icy interruption was anyone's guess. What came next? Well, that was still wrapped in snow and stardust, waiting just around the bend. As the hush of night wrapped more tightly around the slow, slumbering line of wagons, silence came not as emptiness, but as a soft companion, layered with the creak of frozen leather, the occasional grumble of horses, and the gentle settling of snow atop canvas. Most of the travellers had long since burrowed into their quilts, their dreams likely featuring a stagecoach that didn't rattle, or butter that churned itself. But just as folks began dozing into the kind of sleep earned only after hauling an ox yoke through a snow squall, Edwin Barclay, master whittler, amateur philosopher, and notorious night snacker, was wide awake, nose poking out from his buffalo hide blanket like a curious prairie dog. He was staring at the canvas ceiling above, which fluttered slightly from a breeze determined to prove aerodynamics to be the enemy of early settlers. He had, it must be said, eaten too many beans for supper. The night had layered itself with snowflakes large enough to catch on eyelashes and delicate enough to shame Victorian lace. Out here in the middle of nowhere, or, as it was known on mid-19th century maps, somewhere between Fort Laramie and a hope for spring, the snow wasn't just a weather event. It was a full sensory experience, whispering, glinting, muffling, muting. Inside the wagon, the air was thick, not only with the earthy sweetness of damp wool and cabbage-based dinners past, but also with a fragrance known only to those unfortunate enough to bunk near someone with a fondness for smoked liver jerky. "Betsy," Edwin whispered, nudging his wife of 16 years. "You awake?" A pause, then a muffled, "No." "I was just thinking," he said, not deterred in the least by her stated unconsciousness. about whether anyone has ever tried putting socks on a chicken, just in case their feet get cold. Silence. Then a sigh that sounded quieter than resignation, but louder than affection. "I mean," he continued, eyebrows pillowing together earnestly in the dim lantern light, "we wrap the oxen's feet with burlap sometimes. Seems only fair to get the hens involved. Fair's fair." Betsy turned over, her bonnet rustling like irritated parchment. "Edwin, I swear to St. Pioneeria, patron saint of sleep-deprived women, if you wake the baby with poultry footwear philosophy again." That was warning enough for Edwin, who resumed his whittling of a rather uninspired snowman from a leftover parsnip. Outside, Old Man Milford, who claimed to have been born during a thunderstorm on a riverboat and may or may not have been partially baptized in whiskey, was arguing in his sleep. The unfortunate recipient of his somnolent oration was his hat, which had fallen over his face like a very unimpressed judge's wig. Mumbling phrases like, "You can't tax a man's biscuits," and "That ain't a real petticoat, that's a curtain," he remained curled atop his bedroll, a monument to the eccentricities granted only by age, altitude, and a suspicious root cellar brandy. Not far off, the campfire was reduced to embers, still warm enough that a passing prairie mouse had dragged a matchstick into the ash ring and propped it up like a tiny camping pole. The mouse was either camping or staging avant-garde performance art. Opinions were mixed. Somewhere in the wagon circle, a lullaby drifted out, soft and a little off-key, sung by young Clara Madison to her little brothers. It was one of those tunes stitched half from remembered nursery rhymes, half from sheer midnight invention, with lyrics like, "Hush now, the moon's got sheep to count. The stars have tucked the hills in tight. Close your eyes, your dreams amount to more gold than 49ers delight." And so the night spun on, quiet but never truly still. The snow thickened, the sleep deepened, and time seemed to stretch like taffy over an open fire. The kind of night where clocks forget their job and the world feels folded gently under the weight of the sky. Above it all, the moon held its breath behind a soft veil of silver-grey clouds, watching the rest of them gently drift between history and hibernation. And up ahead, in the whisper of snow and sleep, something awaited just beyond the trees. Something not quite morning, not quite memory, just on the edge. Of dreaming, the snow had finally stopped, like even weather itself had, grown sleepy. Around the dark prairie, an uneasy hush settled over the trail, broken only by the occasional groan of wood contracting in the cold, and the wind whispering gently through the canvas flaps of the wagon. Peaceful, if a bit squeaky. Inside, the passengers of the worn and weather-kissed covered wagon had arranged themselves in configurations that might generously be called creative sleep postures. Elbows where no elbows should be, feet disguised as pillows. Someone, a cousin maybe, was definitely snoring directly onto the biscuits. The campfire outside had dwindled to orange whispers, curling into the sky like old secrets. The smell of it threaded through the canvas. Smoke, charred pine, and the faint ghost of organ meat stew. You couldn't say it was pleasant exactly, but after a week on the trail, it would have qualified as perfume. Pioneer Chanel No. 5, ashes and elk. Somewhere near the foot of the wagon, young Eleanor had finally, definitively kicked off her second wool sock, which had been plotting its escape all week. It now curled on the cold wagon floor, like a tiny, sullen snake. Socks, it turns out, were as migratory as the people wearing them. Harold, the patriarch and reigning wagon snore champion, was muttering softly in his sleep. Something about axle grease and that confounded axle again. In fairness, 19th century axle grease was often just animal fat and luck, so you can understand his concern. Supplies were precious and prone to running off, melting, or being eaten by the dog, often in that order. Above them, the stars flared across the sky in chilling brightness, like ancient embers flung from the universe's own fire. Even the moon seemed reluctant to rise, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps simply tired of watching so many boots falling apart in Wyoming. Earlier that day, they had trudged through a windbreak where the trail guide swore he saw bear tracks. Eleanor, the ever-vigilant, suggested they were just unruly cow prints, and was met with scandalized gasps and a long sermon on the difference between hoof and paw. Vigilant or not, she wielded sarcasm like a bonneted saber. Now, adjoining wagons huddled like ironclad sheep in the night, their lanterns long extinguished. Somewhere, a fiddle note drifted in the distance, half melody, half memory, probably the Swenson boy in Wagon 3, whose entire personality consisted of fiddle, freckles, and a deep, suspicious passion for pickled eggs. He called his violin Lorraine and claimed she played better during snowstorms. Most of the camp agreed, if only because correcting him seemed exhausting. Just beyond the canvas, the snow had begun to freeze into little crusts, crunching under the toes of curious raccoons plotting their nightly raids. Pioneer raccoons, be it known, had a particular knack for making off with flapjacks, undergarments, or, most famously, a single, well-polished spittoon in the summer of 1845, a heist so thorough it was still spoken of in scandalized whispers. As the wind quieted to a soft hush, the wagon groaned again, a slow exhale from its wooden bones. Everyone inside nestled deeper into their blankets, scratchy, much-mended things, with stories of their own. One had once been a curtain in Ohio, another, an old military coat stitched into a square. History wrapped around them, threadbare and stubborn. And in that warmth, imagination drifted away from the toil of wheels and frozen salt pork into gentler territory, dreams of home, of meadows that didn't try to tip your cart, and evenings with warm brick hearths instead of hastily buried fire pits and wind that always had somewhere more important to be. Outside, the prairie slept in its vastness, keeping secrets under the ice-crusted grasses, buffalo hoofprints, arrowheads, and the detritus of thousands who'd passed before. The trail stretched endlessly westward, but for now, it paused. In the silence, you could almost believe the whole world had curled up with them, resting deep beneath the stars. The covered wagons, the shivering wind, the stubborn wheels and curious animals, all settling just for a little while. So let the snow settle. Let the embers die down. Lay your head on the burlap-stuffed pillow, and don't worry about tomorrow's ruts or the biscuit thief 3 blankets over. The trail can wait. Sleep has always known the way.